As a way of reviewing for those that have been around Chesapeake for quite a while, and for those new to the region, to provide an introduction, I'm going to go over 7 Chesapeake Bay literacy principles. And this is also written up in a blog, which is URLs given here. The 7 principles of Chesapeake literacy are the following. 1. Chesapeake Bay is a large, shallow, and productive estuary formed by a drowned river valley. 2. The extensive Chesapeake watershed is connected to the bay by a myriad of streams and rivers. 3. Chesapeake Bay is particularly vulnerable to runoff of nutrients, sediments, and toxicants. 4. Climate change and land use alteration are major drivers for Chesapeake Bay and its watershed. 5. Chesapeake Bay supports unique human cultures and livelihoods. 6. American history has been shaped by Chesapeake Bay. And 7. Chesapeake Bay is extremely well studied and intensively managed. So I'll go through each of these 7 one by one. The first, I'll break it up into a couple components. The Chesapeake Bay is a productive estuary. So Chesapeake has this 2-layer flow with fresh water coming in on the left and then salt water coming from below, and the mixing of that fresh and salt water over that extensive 200-mile-long estuary produces a rich estuarine productive habitat with marshes on the edges, aquatic grasses, blue crabs, oysters, striped bass, and it's incredibly productive for fish and shellfish along that extended salinity gradient. The size and dimensions of Chesapeake are pretty significant. One, it's very large, as I mentioned, 200 miles top to bottom, and you can see from this bathymetry graph on the left the old river valley from the Susquehanna River down the main stem. And then, but what's really important is the rest of the bay, other than that relatively deep channel, is extremely shallow. The average depth of Chesapeake Bay is about 8 meters, and you can see in the upper bay the relationship between depth and the percent of the area or volume of that depth. And you see the upper bay is really shallow, pretty much all less than 10 meters. In the mid bay, there are some deeper bits that get down to 30 meters, and the deepest portion of Chesapeake Bay are less than 40 meters generally. And in the lower bay, it's actually not as deep as in the mid bay. So you can see that this is a large, shallow bay with all these dendritic river systems. The second literacy point is that the extensive watersheds connected to the bay by a myriad of streams and rivers, and you can see this on the watershed map. And it's a very large watershed extending up into New York State, half of Pennsylvania, virtually all of Maryland, about half of Virginia, and then little bits of West Virginia, Delaware, and New York. And you can see these both the major rivers, but then the streams and creeks that feed into those rivers. And you really virtually can't go anywhere in this watershed without a 15-minute walk arriving at one of these little streams. The watershed spans several different physiographic provinces, and if we start down at alongside the bay, there's this very flat coastal plain, and then this red line that demarks the distinction between the coastal plain and the Piedmont. That's called the fall line, and the fall line is where the waterfalls occur, where navigation coming up the bay in sailing ships was initially stopped. And in fact, what you'll see is that all the major cities are on that fall line, because that's where the boats stopped and people had to get out and start transiting by land, or at least portaging around the falls. And then the Piedmont, which is rolling hills that are soft, unconsolidated sediments that have eroded off of the Appalachian mountain range. And then going up to the north and west, you see the ridge and valley, including the Blue Ridge, one particular ridge and valley system, which are up and down in striated lines until you get to the Appalachian Plateau, which is the higher, sort of constantly high elevations. The watershed's dominated by several major rivers, particularly the Susquehanna River, which drains the entire top of the watershed. Most of the Pennsylvania and New York watersheds are drained by the Susquehanna. The second biggest is the Potomac River. The Potomac, in the purple there, extends out to western Maryland and West Virginia. And then a series of smaller river systems. Going south from the Potomac, you see both you see the Rappahannock in the dark purple, then the two rivers, Montpony and Pamunkey, which combine to form the York River, and then the James and Appomattox, which are the southern portion of the watershed. Also included are the Patuxent and the Choptank on the western shore and eastern shore, where the Chesapeake Biological Lab and Horn Point labs are, respectively. The third point is that Chesapeake Bay is particularly vulnerable to the runoff of nutrients, sediments, and toxicants. And looking at the watershed map, what you see is that fall line with extensive urban development: Washington, Richmond, Virginia, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, fall in that fall line. But you also see other urban areas in the red, but extensive agricultural development in the yellowish orange. And then these bands of development interspersed with forest and lesser intensive land uses. So there's lots of runoff from those factors. And the problem with Chesapeake is it's naturally retentive for nutrients. That's one of the reasons it's so productive to begin with. So there's 6 factors that Mike Roman and colleagues identified that serve to trap and retain nutrients and make this bay so productive. And starting on the right, the upper bay, the estuarine turbidity max, or ETM, is where the Susquehanna flow meets the salt water. This ETM also occurs in the upper Potomac and the other big rivers, and serves as a rich area for phytoplankton, zooplankton, and then fish and fish recruitment, where the striped bass release their eggs. And so this is an important area, and it moves up and down depending on the flows. The hydraulic control down in the middle of the bay is near the mouth of the Potomac, is where there's a bathymetry change in the bay, which causes a front to develop, and pretty routinely this front sets up and creates these hotspots for productivity. Down at the mouth of the bay, it's actually relatively shallow with these incised, with basically a sandbar across the mouth, but incised by these channels, and these, which are actually dredged for shipping, to maintain shipping navigation. But that sets up these tidal fronts, and if you drive over the bridge tunnel down across the bottom of the bay, you'll often see these striated lines where these convergence and divergence zones occur. And then down at the mouth of the bay is so wide and large at the mouth that it actually sets up its own convergence eddy, sort of like the offshore eddies that occur off the Gulf Stream. This is an oceanographic feature that occurs when you get the spinning of the tidal input of the water coming up the eastern side of the bay, and then shortcutting around to in a counterclockwise way, and that creates convergence zones. And then river plumes, which occur in high flow periods when the top layer of fresh water goes in and meets the salt water. And then finally, this lateral front or picnic line tilt. If the wind is blowing up or versus down the bay, the effect of the Coriolis impact of that wind stress on the bay actually causes the picnic line, the salt to fresh boundary, to tilt one way or another, and that brings in little hot spots. So those are reasons why this bay is so naturally productive. Another really important part of Chesapeake Bay is that the climate change is a major driver for the bay and its watershed, and you can see the temperature graph. This is temperature taken off of the CBL pier, and you can see this net rise of temperature that's accelerated in the past several decades. Now, the climate projections that have been done actually depend on the different emission scenarios, place the bay, and the bay is not going to migrate, but the equivalent temperature is going to migrate. So by 2100, depending on how well we do at reducing greenhouse gas emissions, the bay is going to be much more like a South Carolina or Florida ecosystem. And think about the implications of the plants and animals that live in those ecosystems versus our current Chesapeake Bay. The other aspect to change is land use change, and it's undergone major changes and continues to do so. Grace Brush looked at paleontological data and inferred that beavers used to populate the pre-colonial bay and do a lot of damming and trapping, retaining the water on the landscape, lots of wetlands. Early colonial days pretty much trapped out the beavers and started deforestation. But in the intensive ag phase, the watershed for tobacco and other crops was deforested. We've actually reforested some of those intensive ag areas, but of course increased the urbanization footprint. So these changes are historic, have been massive, and are continuing. The population growth in the Chesapeake watershed is pronounced. The little way you can, one way to view the population growth in the last 100 years is that the equivalent of 10 bus loads, 10 large megabus loads of people have arrived to live in Chesapeake Bay every day for the last 100 years. So that projected growth continues to increase. Chesapeake watershed's an attractive place for people to live. Most of the population growth is migration from outside the watershed. Fifth point is Chesapeake Bay supports unique human cultures and livelihoods. This is a photograph of a skipjack, one of the classic oyster dredging boats. A couple fantastic accounts of those old ways of Chesapeake Bay include Beautiful Swimmers and by Bill Warner, and then Island at a Time, which is Tom Horton wrote about living out at Smith Island. And these watermen, people who relied on the bay resources for their livelihoods, had really interesting, unique cultures. Number 6, American history has been shaped by Chesapeake Bay. You can see John Smith statue there. This is Fort McHenry, a photograph where defending Baltimore from the British, and as part of the War of 1812, Francis Scott Key wrote the Star Spangled Banner. You can see ships at Jamestown, one of the first American colonies, and then George Washington ending the Civil War, the Revolutionary War with General Cornwallis at the mouth of the York River, Yorktown. And a lot of these Civil War battle sites in the map on the right dot the Chesapeake watershed. You can't go very far without finding an arrowhead, a musket ball, or some remnant of American history. And then finally, Chesapeake Bay is extremely well studied, and this is a diagram that shows the different phases of science, of Chesapeake Bay science. An estuarine science phase that occurred from 1925 to 1970, and that's where the focus was understanding estuarine processes. The eutrophication science phase followed, and that's where the nutrients that were affecting the bay were elucidated as a major issue. And then a coordination phase where the Bay program set up a water quality monitoring program, and there was a modeling, large modeling effort. And now we're gone through this accountability phase with report cards and assessments, and it's all going into a future phase, which we're going to be talking more about with regards to emerging issues. And then finally, I didn't say well managed, but I will say that Chesapeake Bay is intensively managed, and particularly the Chesapeake Bay program with its partnership led by EPA with a bunch of institutions, federal institutions, as well as the various states and with science inputs. And then I will ask the question that I want to pose this question: is the Chesapeake Bay being well managed? I mean, it's extremely well studied. It's intensively managed. There's heightened awareness. A lot of people understand the issues. It's well funded on a national or international scale, but it's continuing to degrade. And several books that contribute to this debate were occurred and an important newspaper article occurred in 2003. The publication of Chesapeake Futures that Don and others wrote about the projections of climate and other issues facing Chesapeake Bay. Tom Horton's revision of Turning the Tide, and then Howard Ernst's Chesapeake Bay Blues all highlighted the issues. But most importantly for the Bay program is it got a front page Washington Post, which led to a lot of ramifications in terms of the scrutiny of Chesapeake Bay program. So this is a question that we're going to be asking our visitors, and we'll need to, with this background, we can start looking at some of these issues. Thanks.